This was not a battle meant to be fought. It was meant to be an execution. At the foot of Mount Kassel stood over 30,000 Royal French soldiers, heavy cavalry, professional infantry, banners of the crown snapping in the wind. They were led by King Philip VI of France, young, confident, and determined to end rebellion before it infected the kingdom. Above them waited barely 16,000 Flemish fighters. No knights, no cavalry, no noble command. Weavers, farmers, town guards. Men armed with pikes, clubs, and the certainty that retreat meant submission. The cause was simple. The Flemish had refused taxes, refused royal authority, refused to kneel. By every rule of medieval warfare, this ends one way. Professional soldiers crush militias. Cavalry shatters footmen. Kings erase defiance from history. The mathematics were absolute. And yet, by nightfall, the French army lay broken. To understand how an untrained force crushed one of Europe's most powerful royal armies, we have to return to the decision that forced both sides onto this hill. It was dangerous for a king. Its towns were rich from wool and cloth, its merchants powerful, its people armed, not with swords, but with collective leverage. For generations, Flemish cities had paid taxes reluctantly, obeyed kings selectively, and resisted anything that smelled like outside control. Then the pressure increased. French officials tightened taxation. Royal agents interfered in city governance. Guild autonomy was squeezed, one decree at a time. To the crown, this was administration. To the towns, it was suffocation. In Bruges, Ypres, and Ghent, anger didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, slow, quiet, resentful. Men argued in workshops. Voices dropped in taverns. Hands lingered longer on tools that could double as weapons. The rebellion didn't begin with a battle. It began with refusal. Taxes went unpaid. Royal orders went ignored. French symbols were torn down in public squares. At the center of it all stood Nicholas Zanakin, not a knight, not a noble, but a man who understood something kings often missed. These towns did not see themselves as subjects. They saw themselves as stakeholders. When violence finally broke out, it spread fast and ugly. French loyalists were attacked. Officials fled. Local militias made of craftsmen and laborers organized themselves with frightening speed. From the French perspective, this was not politics anymore. It was insubordination, and insubordination demanded an example. King Philip VI did not march to negotiate. He marched to erase. A royal army assembled, one of the largest France could field without calling a full national levy. Knights sharpened lances. Commanders expected an execution, not a campaign. The plan was simple. March into Flanders, force the rebels to fight, crush them in open ground. The Flemish understood this too. They knew they could not win a long war. They knew they could not outrun cavalry, and they knew retreat would fracture their coalition. So they made a decision that would trap both sides. They chose Mount Kassel, a hill, narrow approaches, broken terrain. It was not a fortress. It was a statement. If the French wanted obedience, they would have to climb for it. By the time both armies moved, the clock had started ticking. One side marched to restore royal order. The other prepared to gamble everything. The battle was no longer a question of if, only where, and how brutally. By the time the French banners moved north, this was no longer a rebellion in the crown's eyes. It was a test of authority. King Philip VI of France was still early in his reign. He needed certainty, fast, visible, undeniable. Letting a militia revolt survive would invite others to try the same. So he assembled force, not finesse. The French army numbered over 30,000. Heavy cavalry formed its spine. Armored knights trained for shock, disciplined, confident, used to breaking enemies in minutes. Behind them marched professional infantry, crossbowmen, and levies drawn from loyal territories. This was not a feudal rabble, it was a royal instrument. The French commanders expected a chase, not resistance. In their experience, militias scattered the moment cavalry appeared. Battles were decided before noon, clean, predictable. The Flemish army looked nothing like that. Around 16,000 men, most with no formal military training, no knights, no horses, no aristocratic command structure. What they did have was cohesion, guild units that trained together, lived together, trusted each other. Their weapons were simple but brutal: long pikes, gendegs, heavy clubs tipped with iron, tools designed to stop momentum, not win duels. And they understood one truth clearly: if they fought on open ground, they would die, so they didn't. Mount Kassel wasn't chosen for glory, it was chosen for denial. Slopes that broke cavalry charges, narrow paths that compressed numbers, uneven ground that punished speed. This was not a plan for victory. It was a plan to survive long enough to matter. As the French army advanced, confidence rolled downhill with it. The rebels were cornered. Supplies were limited. Escape routes were few. Everything pointed to an inevitable collapse. But inevitability can be deceptive. Both sides arrived believing the same thing, that the outcome was already decided. Only one of them was wrong. The first contact did not begin with a charge. It began with movement. At dawn, French scouts pushed forward, riding light and fast, expecting the familiar signs of collapse: abandoned camps, scattered rebels, men already drifting away from the hill. They found none of it. The Flemish line was already formed. Not elegant, not armored, but dense. Men stood shoulder to shoulder on the slopes of Mount Kassel, pikes angled forward, clubs grounded, banners low. No shouting, no drums, just waiting. From below, the formation looked wrong. Too tight, too static, too confident. French commanders read this as fear. They ordered a probing advance, infantry first, crossbowmen moving up to soften the line. Bolts hissed uphill, clattering against shields and wood. A few Flemish men fell. The line closed without panic. No retreat. That hesitation mattered. It bought time. Philip Sussex was watching from the rear, surrounded by his household knights. He saw what he expected: rebels absorbing punishment, burning through courage that could not last. So he did what French kings had done for generations. He unleashed cavalry. Trumpets sounded, spurs bit. Armor shifted, as hundreds of knights began to climb. This was the decisive moment. At least it should have been. Cavalry required speed. Speed required space. Mount Kassel offered neither. Horses labored uphill. Formations compressed. Lances dipped too low. Momentum bled away with every stride. The Flemish did not break. They stepped forward. Pikes met chests. Godendags smashed into knees. Horses screamed and fell, rolling into those behind them. The slope became a trap. Knights dismounted unwillingly, dragged down by weight and angle, fighting men who did not duel, but swarmed. From below, it looked like confusion. From above, it was controlled violence. French officers shouted for order. Signals were lost in the noise. Units advanced without coordination, expecting gaps that never opened. And slowly, dangerously, the arithmetic began to change. This was no longer cavalry versus militia. It was men fighting uphill, exhausted, hemmed in, losing horses faster than they could replace them. The opening move had failed. And worse, the French army had committed itself to ground it, did not control. What followed was not retreat. It was entanglement. And once entangled, even the strongest army can bleed. What failed first was not discipline. It was belief. French commanders expected resistance to crack under pressure. Instead, every failed push tightened the trap. Knights dismounted and could not remount. Horses panicked on the slope, colliding with men behind them. Orders slowed. Signals vanished. The hill erased hierarchy. Veteran knights found themselves fighting beside foot soldiers they had never trained with. Armor that promised protection became a liability. Heavy, hot, unforgiving. Men slipped in blood and mud, struggling to rise under the weight of steel. Above them, the Flemish pressed closer, not rushing, not scattering, advancing in bursts. They struck where the French were weakest: knees, throats, horses. They dragged men down and finished them quickly. No ransom, no pause, This was not chivalric war. It was urban violence transplanted to a hillside. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. The French had committed too much to pull back cleanly, but not enough to break through. Each new wave climbed into wreckage, left by the last fallen horses, broken lances, bodies that blocked movement. Confusion spread faster than orders. A banner went down. Another unit advanced without support. A commander was unhorsed. Someone shouted that the line was breaking. It wasn't, but fear does not wait for confirmation. The Flemish sensed it. They surged. This was the moment they had prepared for. Not victory, but instability. The moment when numbers stopped mattering and positioning decided everything. King Philip VI received fragmented reports, conflicting, delayed, optimistic in tone, alarming in detail. He was told the rebels were stubborn, but nearly spent. That was the most dangerous lie of the day, because what was actually happening was simpler and far worse. The French army was no longer attacking as a whole. It was fighting as pieces, and pieces can be destroyed. Once the pressure tipped, there was no clear command to reverse it. Retreat, downhill, meant collision. Holding position meant encirclement. Advancing meant climbing into a wall that refused to move. The certainty that had carried the French army north was gone. In its place stood a realization no one wanted to say out loud. This battle was no longer under royal control, and the Flemish were no longer defending. They were about to decide the outcome. The breaking point did not come with a trumpet blast. It came with exhaustion. French knights had been fighting uphill for hours, armor soaked with sweat, arms numb from repeated blows, horses dead, wounded, or gone. The ground beneath them was no longer earth. It was a churned mass of mud, blood, broken shafts, and bodies. Every step forward required effort. Every step back risked collapse. This was where battles were usually decided by command, but command had dissolved. Messages moved slowly uphill and faster downhill. Officers shouted orders that could not be carried more than a few yards. Men fought the battle in front of them, not the one planned hours earlier. The Flemish understood this instinctively. They did not rush. They compressed. Guild units advanced together, shoulder to shoulder, tightening the space the French needed to maneuver. Pikes lowered. Clubs rose and fell. The fighting became intimate, faces inches apart, breath hot through visor slits. A French knight fell. Then another, then a cluster. Each fall mattered more than the last, because fallen men blocked movement, fallen horses blocked entire paths, and every obstacle slowed the units behind, turning momentum into congestion. Some French soldiers tried to disengage. They couldn't. Retreat downhill meant crashing into advancing troops. Turning sideways meant exposing unarmored gaps. Standing still meant being dragged down. Panic did not explode. It leaked. A unit began drifting backward without orders. Another followed, mistaking movement for command. Somewhere on the slope, a banner dipped and did not rise again. That was enough. Shouts turned sharper. Voices cracked. Someone yelled that the king was in danger. Someone else yelled that the line was gone. Neither was fully true. Both were believable. The Flemish pushed harder, not chaotically, deliberately. They targeted officers. They surrounded isolated knots of resistance. They struck horses first, then men. They used the hill like a wall, pressing the French against it until there was nowhere left to stand. The rout began before anyone named it. Men started running downhill. At first it was organized withdrawal, then it became avoidance. Then it became flight. Running in armor is difficult. Running downhill in armor through bodies is lethal. Men tripped. Men were trampled. Men were cut down from behind. The Flemish followed, not in pursuit, but in harvest. This was the most dangerous phase of medieval battle, the moment when losses multiplied faster than resistance. Discipline no longer protected anyone. Skill no longer mattered, only direction. King Philip VI was finally pulled away by his household guard, not in triumph, not in command, but in urgency. The realization was unavoidable. The royal army was breaking, not tactically, psychologically. What had begun as punishment had turned into disaster. By late afternoon, Mount Kassel belonged entirely to the Flemish. The slope was littered with French dead, knights who had expected ransom, infantry who had expected superiority, officers who had expected obedience. The rebels stood where kings were supposed to stand, and the cost was not finished. Because routes do not end when fighting stops, they end when fear does, and fear was still running downhill. When the noise finally faded, the hill did not look victorious. It looked emptied. Mount Kassel was silent in the way only battlefields become silent, not peaceful, not resolved, just exhausted. Bodies lay where they had fallen, twisted across the slope, tangled with broken lances, shattered shields, and dead horses that still wore royal tack. French armor caught the light in fragments, helmets split, mail torn open, banners trampled into the mud. The scale of the loss became clear slowly. French casualties were catastrophic. Thousands lay dead, thousands more were wounded, scattered, or missing. Entire knightly contingents had ceased to exist as formations. This was not the kind of defeat medieval armies recovered from overnight. For the Flemish, the losses were real, but survivable, heavy, painful, personal, yet nothing like what lay below them. The casualty ratio shocked contemporaries. A professional royal army destroyed by militia. Chroniclers struggled to explain it without sounding unbelievable. Some blamed terrain. Others blamed arrogance. A few blamed God. None could deny the result. The psychological impact was immediate. Across France, nobles demanded explanations. Knights who had survived spoke of confusion, panic, and being pulled from their horses by men they had never considered equals. Across Flanders, the message spread faster than victory songs. They had done it. Not negotiated, not delayed, defeated. But victory carried weight. Weapons had to be buried with the dead. Wounded men had to be carried back to towns already stretched thin. Guilds lost skilled workers they could not easily replace. Families absorbed grief alongside pride, and above all there was fear. Because kings do not forgive examples. Philip VI survived. France endured, and royal memory is long. Mount Kassel did not end the struggle between crown and cities. It escalated it. It proved that militia could kill knights, but it also proved that rebellion invited relentless retaliation. Still, something irreversible had happened. The myth was broken. The idea that noble blood guaranteed victory, that armor ensured dominance, that common men could only lose. From this point forward, every European ruler would remember Kassel, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. When numbers meet terrain, when discipline meets cohesion, when arrogance meets preparation, even kings can be crushed.